Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is a bit of an unusual topic for me in the sense that when Craig and I normally discuss maybe something I'd like to speak about or something that he'd like me to speak about, I'm usually the content guy. I have lots of history, science, other things that we can talk about, legal history, etc. But when we were negotiating and kind of talking about the topic, one of the things that Craig noticed as we were speaking was that I really like to learn new things. And he said, people like to learn new things. So maybe we can have you talk about what you've discovered as an educator and as yourself, a lifelong learner, that you can share with people. And I said, that's really interesting. But in a way, some of this stuff seems kind of obvious, or at least it seems obvious to me now. But as I went through the material, I realized that when I learned a lot of these points, they were actually really revelatory to me. They were new and they were exciting. So I hope you can join me in some of that excitement. Some of you I know are really good lifelong learners. I know many of you, and I know that you know lots. But what I aim to do today is try to help you become even more efficient and effective in your learning. Now, as I walked up on stage today, I realized one of the really interesting things about this audience is that in a way, you already possess one of the key secrets to how to be a better learner. But you're not going to tell me because you're keeping it a secret. So let me see if I can elicit that from you. We're going to start with an imagination exercise. For most of you, this won't be anything that you've ever experienced before. For some of you, it might, so it might not be so much imagination, but let's get started. Start thinking about the most fundamental human needs. What are the things that every human being, no matter where they live and in what time they live, that they need? Food, water, clothing, shelter. Let's start with shelter. Let's do shelter. Let's focus on this. Think about the types of human habitations. Think about the various range of them. Different ways that people have constructed places to live. Now, build one. I mean, in your imagination at least. I'm going to charge you with the exercise that you're going to be the project manager for a new 20-story apartment building. I'm going to provide you with the capital. I'm going to provide you with the land. Heck, I'm even going to secure the permits. And I'm going to give you the labor. All you have to do is direct the project to make the day-to-day crucial decisions about what goes where, when to do what, who needs to be on site, who doesn't, and just get the job done. Everything you need is right in front of you. All the materials, as I said, the capital, the labor, the permits, all the things that you need. All you have to do, I've hired the laborers, I've bought the materials, you just make the building. So let's say I return in a year or so to see how you've done. Might be intimidated by that timeline. But remember, at the height of the Great Depression, the Empire State Building was constructed and finished just over a year. So if you guys can't do this in an actual, flourishing economy, like what are you doing? Okay, maybe that's a little bit intimidating. But remember, you don't have to do anything physical. You don't have to nail anything. You don't have to weld anything. You're simply the decision maker. You're the brains behind it all. You're the key executive in this operation. I even haven't asked you to do anything fancy. I don't want this 20-story apartment building on the side of a cliff in the Rocky Mountains. I don't want fancy new materials. I don't want space-age technologies. I simply want a buck standard 20-story apartment building, designed and erected by you, with all of the materials I provide you. Now, knowing that you're all pretty smart and savvy, I do have to put two caveats on this. Your imagination might get a little crafty, and so I want to make sure that you understand what the constraints are. I'm not asking you to subcontract this job. You cannot just hire someone else out to do it. This is you. You have to do it. And you can't use anything prefab, right? I'm not going to provide you with materials that are like blocks that you put together to build an apartment complex. So that seems like a fairly strict limit, but I'm going to incentivize you. Here's your incentive. If you successfully complete the project in 1 year, not only will I transfer the property to you, I'll give you $1 million to boot. Are you sufficiently incentivized? You seem a little intimidated. Okay, let's be a little more modest. How about you just simply build a 2,500 square foot home for yourself? Same premises. I give you the materials, I give you the labor. And through grit and determination, you manage to build this house. What do I see? Well, over here I see 4 cinder block walls and a makeshift roof. Over here, I see a kind of mix between balloon and platform framing. It's kind of a weird Frankenstein house. But some of you actually get a nice house put together. And then you realize, oh gosh, the ducting has to be interior because I forgot to leave room for an HVAC system. And somebody else over here is like, oh, electrical? What do you mean I needed electrical? I didn't know I needed electrical. And then you start to realize, wait a minute. I've been in lots of houses, hundreds of houses. I played with blocks as a child. I built things. Why has this been so ineffective? Right? I got a huge incentive. I was going to get title to the property. I was going to get $1 million to boot. All I had to do was make the decisions about how to erect this habitation. You might ask yourself, well, it's a little bit unfair. No matter how many houses I've been in, I mean, heck, I may have even owned a few houses. No matter how much experience I have of houses, I'm not competent to just build one. You would say, Eric, this is totally unacceptable. This is an unfair exercise. Why are you doing this to me? Well, I would submit, if you think that's an unfair exercise of how to erect the edifice that you're going to live in, why do you accept that with the way that you learn new things? Why do you accept that the edifice of your knowledge, that what you know, which is just as crucial, if not more crucial to your life, your knowledge, what you learn over the course of a lifetime to your survival and your flourishing, why would you accept such a haphazard, inefficient, and expensive way of constructing your knowledge? Well, you don't have to. That's what we're here today to talk about. But there's a problem. You've already learned things. I'm here to teach you how to learn. And you say, well, what do you mean? I already know how to learn things. And I say, no, you have to learn how to learn. Now that seems kind of like a paradox. Like, what do you mean? I have to learn how to learn. How are you going to do that? That's a little weird bootstrapping going on here. I'm going to learn how to learn, but how do I learn how to learn how to learn? I mean, like we're getting into this infinite regress problem, right? And you say, yeah, I have learned things, right? In fact, think about all of the things that you've learned before you even knew how to learn. Right? You learned how to open your eyes, to look at your mother's face, to make sure that your mother fed you. You learned how to coordinate your muscular movement. You developed fine and gross motor skills as you developed as a child. And most impressive, I think, in my mind, is that each and every one of you learned to speak your native language without even trying. No instruction. You were simply exposed to language. No one told you exactly how to shape your mouth and move your tongue in order to produce a particular phoneme that exists in your native language. No one had to say, no, it sounds like this. You just simply heard and listened and it happened. And learning at that age, at the very youngest ages, was incredibly efficient for you. The ages of 0 to 3 and 3 to 6, wow, look at what a child does. You go from a helpless, almost alien-looking creature as you emerge from the womb to a fully functioning child. But why can't we continue to recreate that process as you get older, into teenage years, and most importantly, into your adult years, across all of your life? So instead of asking you to build a building, if I had asked you to imagine, what is the process that you are going to go through, rather than imagine, even ask you, what is the process that you would go through if I asked you in the space of a year to learn a new subject? What would you do? How would you go about it? You all have a method. You would all figure something out. You would go buy books. Maybe you'd develop a prompt to get an AI tutor to teach you the field. You would have all kinds of means of learning new things. But the question is, would you be doing so in the most efficient, longest lasting ways that would be most beneficial to your life? Or would you simply rely upon a kind of craft knowledge? I'll just do it the way I've always done it. Well, most people I say, well, was your learning efficient in your schooling? Not so much. If you just go back and recreate what you did in school, most people would say, yeah, that wasn't the best experience. I definitely learned things. I mean, I made good grades. But would that really be the best way to go about learning now? Would you really want to have to suffer through a semester-long experience of going through this material? You'd say, no, I want to go faster. I want to go more efficiently. I want to know the tools, Eric. I want to know how to do this. Even though I already can learn, I want to learn better. Well, the good news is that cognitive scientists and psychologists have developed enormous knowledge, scientific knowledge, about the best way that human beings learn. The really sad thing is that most people don't know this. In fact, most people's intuitions about what the best ways to learn are actually sometimes the opposite of the truth, which we'll talk about today. People do things that are in fact counter to what is the most efficient way. I want to help you avoid that problem because I can sense that many of you, I mean, you wouldn't be here after all. My lecture wouldn't even be necessary. You guys are all here because you want to learn more. It's by default, you're here. Now, the question is, how do you do so effectively? But before I explain some of the techniques for better and more efficient learning, and before I explain why you should pursue lifelong learning, I want to ask what I think is, around this topic, the deepest and most fundamental question. By the way, what was that secret that you all had? What was that secret that you all had? Not that you already knew how to learn. Curiosity. See, I knew somebody would come up. I gave you a puzzle at the beginning. I told you that you knew something that I wanted to know, but that you were keeping secret from me. Curiosity. We'll get to that more in a minute. But that was lesson number one for those of you taking notes. Lesson number one, curiosity, especially the right kind of curiosity, which we'll talk about, is vital and important to becoming an effective lifelong learner. But I want to ask what I said, one of the deepest and most fundamental questions here. What does it even mean to learn something? That's hint number two, by the way, for those of you taking notes. These are going to come fast and furious. Hint number two, it's always important to define and drive down to the deepest level you can understand a concept, to really grasp that concept. So, the most basic level, learning, this is a rough definition, is the process whereby you act to gain and acquire some knowledge or skill through study, experience, or being taught. Now, the question is that learning is obviously the process that leads to knowing, if it's going right. It's the process that leads to knowing. But what does it really mean to know something? And I think this is where it's helpful to understand that there are different levels of knowing. And often people's experience of learning corresponds to these different levels and leads to a kind of ambiguity when they say that they've learned something. Trust me, with my students all the time, they say, no, Professor Daniels, I learned that. I don't know why I bombed the exam. I learned that material. I say, okay, well, let's talk about how you learned the material. At what level did you learn the material? Right? This is an easy way of thinking about it. There's the what, the when, the why, and the how. Right? Some people learn, they review material, they read a book, and they learn the what. What is the idea? They can state the idea. They can simply make out, quantum physics is the actually, I haven't learned quantum physics, so I can't do that, but they can simply state the idea. Not so much understanding, not so much ability to apply, but they know how to state the idea. They recognize that if there's a question on a test that says, what are Newton's 3 laws? Well, they can rattle those off. But that's all. They have what you would call a kind of identity. They have the ability to represent in words or concepts the things that are corresponding to the answer of a particular question. Now, if that's all we did when we learned, we would be pretty dissatisfied with that. We would be nothing better than parrots, because in a sense, that is parroting. You learn that there is a relationship between symbols, certain words, and other words. And you know that when you see this set of words, you represent these other words as the answer to that question, right? John Searle's famous example of the Chinese translator, a guy sitting in a room, and he has a perfect computer that can tell him exactly how to translate everything into Chinese. And he gets these little slips of paper under the door that are written in Chinese, and he slips little pieces of paper back based on what his computer tells him to write. But he doesn't understand Chinese, but he knows exactly what to do. This is how a lot of students learn, right? This is not how you want to learn. Now, some people learn the when to recognize the appropriate context of a piece of knowledge, right? Yeah, you can say, oh, I can represent this knowledge, I can almost be like a parrot. But some people say, no, sometimes certain knowledge, the appropriate context is important, and sometimes it's not. If I'm learning accounting, for example, I can learn that certain principles of how to do accounts apply in some contexts, but don't apply in others. I know the formula, I can parrot it, but I also start to now understand the concept at a deeper level by understanding when I should use that concept or when I should use that method. I'm now starting to understand where these ideas, this knowledge that I've learned, is appropriate. But then I can also start to understand the why. I can start to understand the derivation of the concept. Why do I need to hold this idea? Why is this idea important in this area? Why does it apply here but not here? Why does it come about in the first place? In other words, where does the idea, where does the knowledge come from? And then finally, I think there's a level of understanding that comes with the how. How do I apply it in a functional way with easy retrieval and the ability to apply it across multiple contexts? That's when you truly understand something. It's the difference between knowing how to do something and knowing how to explain it to someone else. One of the great techniques that many good teachers, in fact, many excellent teachers understand, is that if you want to tell students to study for a test, you can tell them that you're going to have an in-class assessment. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and you're going to be responsible for this material. And the students will go about studying in a particular way. They'll learn the material in a particular way. The better students will learn all of those levels of knowing. Some will only learn some. But if you ask the students, you say, I'm going to assess you because you're going to teach class that day. You are responsible for that material. Boy, do they start to understand it at a much deeper level. They just feel implicitly, there's a certain emotional context there. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to be up there not knowing what I'm talking about. My classmates are going to ask me questions. I need to understand this material. And so almost at an implicit level, they learn it all the way down. Now, to take an example, let's use an example that'll appeal to Andy Bernstein. Do you know how to shoot a basket? Right? How many of you know how to shoot a basketball? Okay, how many of you know what it looks like? Like you could kind of recreate, it's like, you put it in your hands and you make the motion and it kind of goes toward this hoop and, you sort of know it, right? Some of you know the gist of it, right? The levels of knowing, you've seen it before. Maybe you've seen a commercial with Michael Jordan or someone else and you've seen what a basketball shot looks like. Some of you have actually done it, you've practiced, but you don't know all the fundamentals. And you certainly don't know how to do it. And then some of you, like Andy, because I played basketball with Andy before, he not only has the ability, he has such motor memory and experience that he can just sink baskets, boom, 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 because he's got it down. He really knows it. Another way of thinking about this that I think is a really effective way is it's the difference between experience and practice. So how many of you drive automobiles? Is there anyone who hasn't ever driven an automobile? Okay, many of you have probably had thousands, if not tens of thousands of hours of experience driving an automobile. You're experts, right? You've done it over and over and over again. How many of you are better than the average driver? Some of you know this one, yeah. How many of you would, let's do it. Honestly, how many of you would rate yourself as better than the average driver? Yeah, I see more than 50% of the hands. This is mathematically impossible, ladies and gentlemen. But here's the big issue. There's never a time when you can concretize the difference between I have lots and lots of experience with a thing and I have practiced a thing than if you go to a driving school. So I've done this. So I've been to Skip Barber Driving School, if anybody knows that. It's the race car drivers. They teach you how to aggressively drive a vehicle in a way that you probably never want to on public roads. But it's a fun experience. I've been to the BMW Test Driving School, which is right up the road in South Carolina from where I live. When you learn how to drive, you're learning the basics, you're learning how to go through the motions, you're learning how to be safe on the public roads. But it's when you practice driving with a race car driver, you put yourself deliberately into situations, into experiences that you don't normally confront, but which would be incredibly useful to confront. So in Carl's lecture the other day when he was talking about Captain Sully, right? Very few pilots ever contemplate, what would happen if I lost both my engines over the Hudson River, right? And I was only at a few thousand feet of altitude. That's not a thing that they do day to day. But pilots are amazing people, especially military pilots, because when they practice flying, they don't just practice taking a nice clear takeoff and a nice cruising altitude and a nice clear drive. They do all kinds of crazy things. They intentionally turn off their engines. They sometimes intentionally go into spins in order to figure out how to right a plane. They go into dives. They do all kinds of things. Very few of you, I suspect, have done that with your driving because your experience is enough. Your experience of driving is fine. Occasionally, you might find yourself in a crisis situation and you might respond the wrong way. Your wheels are turned and you're slipping into a turn in the icy roads up in the mountains and you don't know how to turn into the skid and as opposed to out of the skid. You don't know when to apply the brakes, when to apply the gas, et cetera, et cetera. But if you practice driving, and by practice, I don't just mean getting experience. And this is a major difference in the way that people understand learning. Apply this to a cognitive field. let's say you've practiced learning, or let's say you've learned about the American Revolution. You know that the American Revolution, for example, you understand it a little bit. You know that it was caused by a broad set of philosophic changes in the understanding of the nature of individual rights among the American colonists in respect to how the British imperial authorities were governing them. But do you really understand that? Can you explain it? Can you practice, for example, proving it to someone who has doubts? Can you explain it to someone who has a different theory? Can you meet them point by point in argument to explain why they're wrong and you're right? This is the difference, I think, between understanding and merely practicing. Practicing is like, oh, but I've read 20 books on the American Revolution, Eric. I say, great. And they all said the same thing. They all said that it was this philosophic change in the culture. It's like, terrific. Do you understand that? No, really what you've been doing is you've been experiencing it, just like you experience driving. You've driven for tens of thousands of hours, you've never practiced, because you haven't ever, in a sense, tested yourself in that knowledge. You haven't put that knowledge against the edge of real conflict to make it real to yourself, to drive into it and say, what does this mean? Is it true? How do I understand it? Et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that this ultimately adds up to is that although it's important to be exposed as a stage of learning, the other side of learning is memory. This is one of the ones that gets a lot of students today. Memory and memorization are really, really sort of dirty words these days. People don't like to think that memory is essential to learning. But as the cognitive scientist Daniel Willingham, it's a great phrase he came up with, memory is the residue of thought. If you don't have anything in memory, I submit you haven't done a lot of real thinking. Now, memory is an important topic when it comes to learning because we have to understand the way that memory works. And again, most people's intuition, I think, about this is often wrong. People think that memory works in one way, and it doesn't really work that way. Now, without getting into a lot of the details, because memory is a somewhat complicated topic, it's easy enough to differentiate on the broad level that there's a difference between what you know as your short-term memory and your long-term memory. Your short-term memory is like what they call your working memory, what you can keep in mind for the time of any sort of short duration. Somebody tells you a phone number and you go to the other room and you call that number. You've put it in your working memory. Maybe you've even rehearsed it. But it basically flies out of your head as soon as you've made the call because you don't need to remember it. It has low storage strength. You didn't bother putting it in your long-term memory. You kept it in your working memory and then you used it and then you transferred it out. Unfortunately, this is the way that a lot of people go about learning. I have a test coming up. I have a performance. I have some need at work to deliver on this promise. So I'm going to put this stuff effectively, not into my working memory, but into effective short-term memory. And then once I've used it, it starts to fade away, right? And the goal of learning is to have it not fade away. Populating your long-term memory with knowledge is what actually ramps up your ability to be a more effective human being. Whatever your calling, whatever your profession, whatever your goals in life, if you don't have a store of knowledge that as you work through the world, you can apply and that you can draw on as part of your long-term memory, you're dependent. You're dependent on looking things up. You're dependent upon asking people how to do things. You're dependent upon reteaching yourself. The goal in life, of course, is to be independent. So the key step is, what is the process by which we take things from our short-term memory as we learn them and ensure that they stick in our long-term memory? And the question ultimately comes down to this. You have to store it. You have to encode it. You have to have a process whereby you ensure that what comes in your senses and then what gets into your short-term memory gets stored in your long-term memory. Because otherwise, it's like you're never going to get it again. And there's a really easy matrix that you can think about. There are some things that are in your short-term memory right now. What's your room number at this hotel? Hopefully you all know that, right? Your retrieval strength, your ability to retrieve that information is incredibly strong right now. What was your hotel room number 2 years ago? I hope none of you know that. I mean, maybe you do. Maybe it was like, oh my God, my room number's my anniversary. Isn't that great? It's my birthday or whatever, right? If it was a significant number, maybe you remember it. But your retrieval strength on that one is incredibly low because your storage strength on that one was very low. You didn't bother to commit it to long-term memory. And because you didn't commit it to long-term memory, after a duration, I mean, I could probably ask you, what was your hotel room number a month ago if you happen to stay at a hotel? It's very low. But let me ask you another question. What's your phone number? Right now, again, you can tell me immediately. I mean, for those of you who haven't been corrupted by the ability of cell phones to just transfer numbers without ever having to tell someone your number, but you can probably tell me your phone number. Easy retrieval and probably good long-term storage. What about your childhood phone number? Now, for those of you like me whose parents still live at the same address with the same phone number, it's really easy to remember my childhood phone number because it's the same number I call my parents. However, for those of you who don't have that experience, your childhood phone number is probably not that easy to retrieve, but it is stored very strong. It is in there. With sufficient prompting and sufficient priming, you can actually probably remember it. The goal for your learning is to make sure that everything fits into that current phone number category, that you have good retrieval strength and that it has good storage strength, that it's going to last. And the techniques to do that are what I think are the most important things to learn about when we learn about how to learn more effectively. Now, one last thing that I don't want to spend too much time on because I realized it would take a whole lecture. But it is also important in learning, not just to be able to learn things effectively, to encode them in your memory effectively, which we'll talk about today, but it's also vitally important. In fact, this may be so important that that's why it deserves its own lecture. You need to reality check. You can't just learn for the sake of learning, right? There's too many books out there. There's too much knowledge. There's too much information. You have to integrate your knowledge. You have to reality check it against your other knowledge. You have to validate it. You have to say, is this actually true? To put it in the parlance of the young today, maybe you guys will all laugh at me because I'm trying to appeal to the young people with their lingo, but you got to make sure your ideas touch grass, right? In other words, they have to be out there in reality. You can't just be a cloistered ivy tower academician. You could fill your brain with all kinds of information. You could learn enormous volumes of knowledge, how to apply it, when to apply it, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't check to see whether it interfaces with the truth, then you might as well be debating how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, right? You need to, and the two principles, I think, and these are kind of my favorite sayings, two principles that I think help with this, two things that you can keep in mind. Don't just read everything you believe. Right? Normally they say, don't just believe everything you read. Right? Be skeptical, check your ideas. But I think it's also important to say, don't just read everything you believe. Expose yourself to contrary ideas. Expose yourself to things that challenge your ideas. Not all the time. Don't just have a diet of disagreeable books. That would be a horrible way to live. But expose yourself, challenge yourself, enter into dialogue with people. Because otherwise, there's a real way in which you don't know your own ideas. This is a principle that I've drawn from Aristotle in his treatise on the rhetoric. Aristotle says that if you don't know the case of your opponent, the best case, to seal man it, so to speak, then you may not truly understand your own. You really have to work hard to make sure that your ideas, in fact, correspond to reality. Now, the other little cute saying I like is, don't just believe everything you think. Right? Don't just automatically think that because an idea occurs to you after you've done some learning on a field, you've studied the history of philosophy and you think you've made a connection and you believe it. And you say, well, that must be true. Have you checked it? Have you tried to integrate it against your other knowledge? Have you determined whether it's true? Have you tested it? Et cetera, et cetera. Now, if learning and understanding really means all that I've said that it does, it's starting to seem like a lot of work. It's no wonder most people, unfortunately, effectively stop learning once they graduate from whatever school that they leave. Maybe adulthood is just a phase of life when we should go about applying our knowledge. We gather our knowledge as young, and then throughout our adult lives, we just apply knowledge. What's the point of learning anymore? Isn't that what school's for? It's supposed to prepare me for life. It would be really uncomfortable, for example, if we had to continue to do the kind of learning that we did as young people in school. As I said, most people didn't have some people had a great experience, but not everyone. Shouldn't it be better? It doesn't have to be that way. So I want to talk today about, I guess, 8 tools, right? I wanted the practical part of my talk today is about these 8 tools that you can use that, again, I say sometimes are counterintuitive about how better to learn things and to encode them into your long-term memory, right? The reality checking, the challenging yourself, that's on you. I want to give you these tools because this is going to get you so far ahead of where you might be. So normally, when we ask about how we study, people say, well, I read the book, I highlight even, maybe I underline, and I read it again, and I read it again, and then I go to the test. More you read, the better you know it, right? No, actually, this is not the case. Scientists have taken subjects across many different ages and across many different subjects. You take one group of subjects and you give them the material that they need to learn, and you allow them to study for 2 hours on a Tuesday and for 2 hours on a Thursday, and then they take an exam on a Friday. You take that same material and you give it to a similarly placed group of students, and you allow them 1 hour to study on Tuesday, you give them a quiz on a Wednesday, you allow them to study on a Thursday, and you give them a quiz again immediately after they're studying, and then you test them on Friday. Who does better? The second group, the people who do what is called by the scientists retrieval practice. In fact, they did these studies to the point where they minimized as much as possible the exposure to the material to see whether that testing effect, so to speak, was actually more effective. Do you know how you minimize it as much as possible? You give the people the exam before you even let them study the material. Something that they do not know. You pre-test them. You give them a test of the material that they're expected to learn, and then you allow them to study it, and then several days later, you give them the test. Compared to students that you allow to study 5 times more without doing the pre-test. Students who do the pre-test do better on the exam. Retrieval practice, the act of recalling from your memory, is one of the key ways that you encode into memory. There is this thing that the cognitive scientists call illusion of fluency. When you read a text over and over again, when you study a field, when you study material, concepts over and over again, they start to seem familiar. They're like when you walk into your house. Each of you, if I could say, close your eyes and walk me into your house. Tell me what's, where there's a stand here and there's a chair here. You could all do this. You could visually do this. This material starts to feel like this. The problem is that you're not going to be able to recall it in that same way. By practicing retrieving the information, by doing pop quizzes with yourself, by testing yourself, by having experiences of recalling the material, what your brain is actually doing is helping to encode that material into your long-term memory. In the same way that you kind of implicitly know that the longer that you repeat the phone number that someone has just told you before you have to dial it, the more likely it is that you'll get it accurately when you get there, right? Very few of you, if I just gave you a random phone number and I said, okay, go dial that in an hour, would successfully do so if you hadn't retrieved it a couple times. If you hadn't said, okay, in 5 minutes, I'm going to see if I can remember the number. And then you test yourself. What's really important about retrieval practice is that you check whether you're doing well, right? The experience of knowing where you made your errors is a vastly important thing to do because it allows you to identify the cognitive gaps. Often students, when they study by not just necessarily the ones who cram, but the ones who just study. They're not identifying what they already know well enough to move on and what they don't know well enough to repeat. And that leads us to the second of the techniques that I want to mention to you, and that's called spaced practice. There are actually now apps on your phone. When I was a teacher with the younger ages, we used to do this literally with flashcards. If students wanted to study material, and you have 3 bins of flashcards. But there are apps that can do this for you now. I think some of the language learning apps, Duolingo, and if any of you know about the app Anki as a study tool, a lot of these things do this automatically for you. But interleaving is basically where you take material, as you review it and you test yourself through retrieval practice, the things that you get right away, you put into the farthest bin. You don't have to review those as often. The things that you make more mistakes on, you put into the middle bin, and the things that you don't know at all, you put into the first bin. And then the next instance of testing yourself, you go through those in a kind of spaced order. You take the things that you do know and that you don't know, and you mix them up. If all you do is study from flashcards, literally just shuffling them, changing the order in which you study the material will make you a more effective learner. Because it's almost as if you're meeting a series of people, and you always remember that Sally comes after Joe. But if suddenly Sally doesn't come after Joe, you might forget her name. But if you have this association, okay, Joe, Sally, it's a lot easier to remember, but you're not actually encoding it. Right? Interleaving that material and doing it in different orders, which even means your first pass. Don't just study Unit 1, Unit 1, Unit 1, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 2, Unit 2 until you get mastery. Study a little bit of Unit 1, study a little bit of Unit 2, study a little bit of Unit 3, maybe 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 1, 5, As you move around like that, it helps encode in your brain more permanently. It gets you that information more yours. Spaced practice, I mean, this is one probably to this room. I hope everybody knows. Usually students, usually students I think are kidding themselves when they think that cramming actually is the most effective way of studying. Spaced practice simply means if you only can dedicate an hour of your life to learning something before the time when you need to learn it, it is better for you to split that up into 10-minute chunks across the time between now and the event than it is to study for an hour the night before, or even the day before, or the few hours before. Massed practice like that, where you just cram. Now, it's effective. Cramming is effective, right? Students who cram do well on exams, relatively speaking, but they don't do well in life because they don't remember. This is the experience. Every professor has had this experience. Every teacher has had this experience. Well, the students did okay on the exam, but by the time we got to the next unit, they had forgotten it all. Now, imagine doing that in a field that is cumulative, a field that requires prior knowledge, which last I checked is, well, every field. Right? There's no new knowledge you can learn that doesn't depend on your prior knowledge. Cramming interrupts that. Elaboration is a great technique. When you're practicing, when you're learning new things, your ability, this is the teaching technique, your ability to explain it to someone else is an enormously valuable test of your understanding of that material. Sometimes people like to say, explain this like I'm a 6-year-old, right? If you can explain something that you've learned, adult knowledge, in terms that a 6-year-old can understand, or that a 10-year-old can understand, or that a colleague can understand, or even that an expert thinks is a good explanation, then you've really mastered that material. Elaborating, in other words, talking about the ideas that you've learned, rather than just keeping them in here, is another way of encoding them. The principle here, which is really starting to string all of these together, is that multiple modalities of encoding, drawing on your memory, explaining, doing different ways of doing the knowledge, that's actually what helps the brain encode that new information into long-term memory. Concretization, right? As part of your elaboration, if you concretize, especially if you're learning abstract knowledge, if you think of things in those principles, but you also reduce them to examples. Vivid examples. The more vivid examples, the better. This is a way that you can actually start to ground your knowledge, as I said, to give it a reality basis. If you can't think of concretizations of your learning, you need to go back and make sure you understand the ideas, because you might not. Now, the second to last of these is a little bit interesting. Robert Bjork at Washington University, St. Louis came up with this idea. And this idea is that learning has to have desirable difficulty. It has to be sufficiently challenging for you to be able to encode it in memory. Now, there are stories of ancient civilizations that would train the young by teaching them information and immediately throwing them into a cold river. They remembered better than other children. It was a bit of a traumatic experience, and I don't think I would recommend it as a means of learning. I don't know if you do cold plunges, maybe you can do it before you do your cold plunge, but that stress experience helps encode the memory. All of us know this. The moments in your own episodic memory, the memory of your own autobiography, that tend to be the most salient, tend to be the ones that are most emotionally charged. You remember things that have deep emotional valence. So when you're learning a new topic, it doesn't mean that you have to be sitting out in the Arctic and, slapping yourself in order to, trying to do Latin conjugations. I mean, maybe that would work, but it's not necessary. What's necessary is that the cognitive experience is sufficiently difficult to challenge you, but not so difficult that it frustrates you. So the desirable difficulty. So what this means is that you have to be aware of your own limitations and your own strengths. You have to go into this knowing that you have to stretch yourself. You can't just do the easy wins. They feel good, but you actually have to push yourself a bit. Now, the last of these, which I think Betsy said at the beginning when I said you had a little secret, is the principle that I call the principle of curiosity. To be an effective learner, you absolutely have to cultivate a curious mindset. You have to be a curious person. You have to care, right? Curiosity comes ultimately from the Latin word for the care, right? You care about something. Now, in the modern world, in fact, in the history of humanity, but in the modern world in particular, the two types of curiosity, or perhaps three types, really matter, right? Scientists who study curiosity, what a wonderful job, by the way. Studying curiosity, I mean, it's like if I could just do anything, I'd just go spend the rest of my life studying curiosity, which would be like looking in the mirror a little bit, but that's okay. But studying curiosity, cognitive scientists describe diversive curiosity, epistemic curiosity, and empathic curiosity. Okay? Now, empathic curiosity is the curiosity about what's it like to be this other person, right? What is it? How does that feel? What is that like? It's the curiosity sometimes that drives us to gossip, right? Sometimes it's the curiosity that drives us to want to meet new people. It's a fine curiosity, but it's not as much about learning. It's a kind of social curiosity. It's the other two types that I want to focus on. Today, in today's world, we are suffused, overwhelmed by diversive curiosity. Diversive curiosity, as in, not as in diversity, but as in a diversion, right? Ooh, what's that? Oh my gosh, what, oh, hey, oh, look at that. Oh, it's all of this sort of novelty in the environment. You're curious about, I've never seen that. This is why clickbait headlines work so well. I've never thought that could be a thing. Florida man does ... Oh gosh, I need to click on that, right? You're curious. But epistemic curiosity, that's the important one. George Lowenstein, the researcher, noted that epistemic curiosity is the thing that drives us to expand our capacities, our knowledge, our ways of living. There's an information gap. There's something that we don't know that's just far enough away that we can reach it with work, right? The desirable difficulty. And we cultivate that by pushing ourselves with something that Craig identified the other day, with good questions. People who study curiosity have discovered a fascinating thing about it as a trait among human beings. Any of you have children? Know that children are inherently curious. In particular, there are certain ages where their curiosity becomes so overwhelming that most parents wilt under the questions, right? There's a series of, but why, but why, but why? But why does that happen? But why does that happen? But why does that happen, right? I mean, it reminds me, well, maybe I shouldn't tell it. It reminds me of the joke that the dad says, the other day my 6-year-old asked me where poo comes from. And so I sat him down and I gave a very elaborate explanation and I tried to remain calm because he's a 6-year-old after all, and I told him. And he looked at me very puzzled, very confused, and after a while he said, well, then where does Tigger come from? For those of you who know the Winnie the Pooh stories, right? These are characters. He wasn't asking, right? Parents often get flustered by this. But here's the fascinating fact. Susan Engel discovered in a work that she wrote about the intellectual lives of children, children begin to ask fewer and fewer questions and have less salient curiosity the more years they go through school. This is a problem, right? We need to maintain what I call a kind of intellectual neoteny, which is a big fancy way of saying we need to be childlike. We need to be childlike in our curiosity. We need to remember that not just the diversive curiosity. Ooh, why is he wearing red? Ooh, what's that? Oh my gosh, oh, what's the latest thing on, on social media? But instead, maintain that kind of curiosity where you say, how do microphones actually work? How is it that it can take the sound from my voice and project it out over these speakers, that's kind of fascinating. There were human beings who discovered this. There were scientists who figured this out, inventors, right? You have this drive to understand things, that you approach your world not as a thing that you can navigate through. You approach knowledge, new things that you see in the media, et cetera, as stumbling blocks, but rather as things that can engage you. You build on that curiosity in a way that the 19th century physicist James Clerk Maxwell said. He had this great expression. He said, "Thoroughly conscious ignorance is the prelude to every real scientific advance." You have to sit in your ignorance. You have to accept that in order to start building that curiosity. Now, I want to put the final piece of the puzzle together for you, because there's a really big question looming. I've convinced you, I've whetted your appetite perhaps by telling you some techniques that you can commit things to memory better. That's the essence of learning, the reality checking, the putting into memory, etc. But there's a problem. What should I learn? My gosh, Eric, there's so much to learn. What should you learn? Assuming you have no immediate career or other externally imposed demands that automatically suggest topics, right? If you're about to have children, you probably ought to learn about child rearing. If you're about to get a promotion where you have a new job task, you probably ought to learn about that new job task. But what if you just want to learn for the sake of living, of flourishing? This is what Scott Young calls the infinite library problem. Right? I once calculated, I'm the kind of nerd that keeps track of every book I've ever read. I have a file on my computer that has every title I've ever read, and much after my wife's prompting, I also have a file of every book I've ever bought, because when I go to used bookstores, my wife really doesn't like it when I buy books that I already own. So I have to go online, I have to go on my phone and check to see whether I've already purchased a book, because I have what the Japanese called sunduku, which is the joy of having more books than you've ever read and just seeing them on your shelves, because there's just knowledge there. But this is a big problem. How do you choose where to start, what to learn? There's an infinite library. Well, Young explains that there are two ways that you can approach this. Exploit or explore, right? You can exploit. You can take things, fields of areas of knowledge that you already understand, and really dive down, become a true expert. You're interested in philosophy. Well, let's say I'm really going to learn philosophy. I'm going to know the history of philosophy. I'm going to know what different philosophers thought. I'm going to be able to explain it. Heck, I'm maybe even going to be able to teach it, because I really want to understand philosophy, because I think it's an important fact about our lives. Right? I'm going to exploit my already existing interest in philosophy by really diving as deep as I can. I'm going to read them in the original. Heck, I'll teach myself Greek so I can read Aristotle, because that's how much I care about philosophy. Okay? Or you can explore. You can find the ways that your knowledge can expand. You can get interested in microphones. You can get interested in new fields. You can delve into new areas. Both of those are incredibly valuable for keeping you actively learning throughout a lifetime. In a sense, it's like you have a T-shaped curve. You have some areas that you go very, very deep, and you have some areas that you go very, very wide. And the choice that you have about those has enormous variation in modality. Think of all the things you can learn. You could learn to play music. You could learn a new language. You could learn sport. You could learn dance. You could learn history. You could learn cooking. I would recommend, based on what I know, and I'm trying to apply this myself, as my wife can verify, I would recommend that everyone try at least 3 modalities. I think there's enormous value in learning a second language, but not for the reasons that most people assume, or that they preach about learning second languages. I think everyone should learn a movement, whether it's dance or sport or Tai Chi or Krav Maga. I mean, pretty far variation there. But movement, the way we learn how to move is equally interesting. Just a quick little aside. If you took a group of, this is again in the Learning Scientists, they do really funny experiments. If you took a group of children and said, in a week, you're going to have a contest to see who can throw a beanbag 3 yards and hit a target. And you give one group of children the opportunity to practice all week throwing a beanbag to a target 3 yards. And then you take another group of children, similarly placed, and you give them the opportunity to learn how to throw a beanbag 2 yards and 5 yards away. They don't get to practice with a 3-yard target. and then you test them on that Saturday, guess who hits the 3-yard target more often? The kids who never practiced on a 3-yard target. It's a really paradoxical result, but it means that there's a kind of sense of just zoning in on one target. You have to have that desirable difficulty. You have to try to challenge yourself in different ways. So learning a movement, whether it's dance, as I said, or sport or whatnot, is really helpful. And then the last thing I would say is learning some new intellectual field, expanding your horizons. Language, the foreign language, just to say a word or two about that, is, I think, a real great trainer of memory because you emphasize all the different aspects of your memory. You use episodic memory as well as semantic memory. Episodic memory is just your memory of your own experiences, your autobiography, what happens to you. And your semantic memory is what you commit, the knowledge that you commit to your brain. Speaking a language and learning a language combine both. But you also start to develop part of what they call your implicit memory. As you speak with native speakers, you begin to pick up, I don't want to, well, you begin to pick up some of the mannerisms, right? You begin to understand the way that different cultures express themselves, right? That there are different ways and gestures and even expressions in the face. Those are implicit memories. They're things that you just pick up on and that you incorporate into your muscle memory. And then there's also a kind of procedural memory, right? Procedural memory is like learning how to do one thing after another, like cooking. Now, the final piece of the puzzle, and how I want to end, is by telling you, if you haven't already been convinced, but I want to make it explicit now, what is the value of lifelong learning? Why should you do this? Well, in one sense, it's very simple. It's to increase your efficacy and your capacity. One of the things that people who study human lifespans, study longevity, and study what it means to flourish across an entire lifespan know that physiologic as well as intellectual headroom, the more space you have above yourself in terms of your capacity, right, is a sign of your ability to flourish. If that headspace, if that limit of your life is very close to you, you don't have a lot of room for error, right? Both physiologically as well as intellectually. But it also allows you to milk your values, right? Luke Travers is a great example of this, right? Luke doesn't, you say, hey, do you like art? Or do you love art? Do you want art to be so suffused throughout your entire character as to be the thing that people identify you with, right? Those of you who know Luke and art are synonymous in your brain. Luke loves art. He milks those values. He is, as Andy Bernstein once used to call people like this, an impassioned valuer. You don't just value something, you value it. But also knowing how to learn and practicing learning makes you a more capable learner going forward. I'm here to tell you that as you age, you will encounter things that you did not know you would need to learn. Not just technology, right? Not just the newest iPhone or operating system, but also new things about yourself, changes in your circumstances. This is the fact of life, change. Being in the habit of always learning means that you will be more resilient to those changes and more capable of confronting them when you have to learn. From a skill side as well as motivationally, right? It gives you a sense of self-efficacy. In a meaningful way, it's also about striving for flourishing as a human being, to take on the powers and the habits and the very forms of excellence that equip oneself for a robust life, to arrive at a fullness of the self-recognition that learning is inherently the open-ended and ceaseless process of facilitating the extension of one's very identity across the span of the past and throwing open new vistas to yet untrodden, awaiting the exploitation of the quintessential human drive to know. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And I am certainly curious about your questions. I've left only a brief slice of time, but so if you can get just straight to the questions, I promise I'll get straight to the answers and we get through as many as possible. Okay. Arthur.
My question is about cramming versus practicing. So as an undergraduate in something like mathematics, the only really way to study is through practice. Like, I don't know how to cram to do U substitutions or integration by
Yeah,
parts.
yeah.
Like, you have to do that, right?
Right.
In other fields, there's this allure of just trying to cram because, like, oh, I can just remember that, right? Like, there's no practice.
Yeah.
How can you cultivate the discipline to do something like practicing in a field where it's like not even obvious what it means to practice it in the way that there is with mathematics?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Mathematics, physics, other fields, statistics, maybe accounting, naturally have problem sets, right? That this is, I mean, you can tell by the textbooks. Cultivating a notion of practice in a field, say like history, right? I mean, how do you practice history? Do you give yourself quizzes about history? Do you try to rattle off facts? One of the things I think that's important is that you have to think about the modality of how you use that knowledge. In the case of mathematics, the reason why you practice problem sets is that it's a sum but any, right? It's the principle that Ayn Rand identified, that it's a sum but any. In the same way in measurement omission, you need to know how to do things, but the values may be anything. There are some values that work in a formula in a certain way. The same thing is true in history. Like if you say, hey, I want to be better about practicing my knowledge of history, you start to analyze things at different scales over different time frames. What caused what? Can I explain the major influences on this thing? And part of that isn't just mental rehearsal. Part of that is actually, like, one of the things you might do is simply write précis of certain historical events that you want to learn. I want to learn about the French Revolution. So I read, I test myself, but then one of the ways that I can practice my knowledge of the French Revolution is that I can just sit down and say, I'm going to write a 500-word summary of the most important facts about the French Revolution. And then I'm going to compare it to what the book said, and then I'm going to do it over 1,000 words. But then I'm also going to do it in a different way. Like, you have to kind of create a set of ways that you're going to use that knowledge in order to facilitate your use of that knowledge, because the problem sets in many ways just aren't there for those fields. Yes.
I have two very brief questions. First, when you are preparing, for example, for exam, when you're graduating university, it feels like you're wasting your time when you're doing anything but preparing for exam. So even though we understand that memory doesn't work in that way, how can we get rid of this fear of lost opportunity?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. There's a huge psychological component to the anxiety around. I mean, you know, if this is an exam that your graduation depends upon, there's a massive psychological component of anxiety, perhaps even fear. And the natural response to that is to be doing something, to be studying more, right? And there, I think, has to be a balance that at a certain point you step back, right? Especially if you're doing the studying in the way where you're doing the testing of yourself, where you're doing the retrieval practice, you will start to develop more of that sense of confidence. If you're not doing that, then of course the natural response is, I've got to study this again, I've got to study this again, I've got to study this again. Because what you've done to yourself is you've removed your own knowledge about how well you know a subject. In a sense, you've given yourself that anxiety by not testing yourself, by not practicing in the appropriate ways, to give yourself the actual real existential knowledge. Hey, actually, I know this part, but now I can study more on this part. So it's partly a confidence issue, but it's partly also that the techniques reinforce the ability to not have that psychological drive to cram. You by giving yourself real evidence that you've learned something, you can then move on to a state of more confidence that you will be able to reproduce that knowledge in the exam conditions. A small point on that, one thing that many students do that actually frustrates their studying as a process is that scientists have discovered that being in similar conditions of the exam as you're studying helps. I mean, literally to the point where they have some people study standing up and some people study sitting, and then alter the conditions when they're tested, and then have the same conditions when they're tested, or in a room listening to music with a certain light, et cetera, et cetera. The more that one can recreate the experience of the test moment in terms of one's environment while you're studying, the better that one will do on the exam. Students, though, often like to have the distractors. They've got the music going, they're eating, they're doing things that won't happen during the exam. And that can give a sense of anxiety because you've situated yourself to a certain sense of knowledge, and then you know, gosh, that's not what it's going to be. So yeah, it's about developing the confidence through testing yourself and making sure that you're setting yourself up for success.
Thank you.
Yes.
And another one, very short question. Yeah. What would you recommend all of us how to act on your talk right now, not to get it passed in your memory just like that?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing, I think the two things that I would recommend that everybody, the actionable items that you can walk away with is that you can do a curiosity inventory. You can ask yourself after you leave, am I actually pursuing new things that I'm curious about? Or am I stalling in my sense of wanting to learn about new things? And why is that? What can I become more curious about? What are those things that I've said throughout my life? Gosh, it would always be interesting to know that, but I'm too busy, or but I wish I could, right? Have you ever thought about, I mean, many of you obviously speak more than one language, and that's incredible. But you know, for those of you who don't, have you ever wanted to learn another language? Have you ever wanted to learn a new field? Do that curiosity inventory. And then the second thing I would recommend as an actionable step is to start diving in. Right? Commit to the process. Figure out what you can fit into your schedule. I mean, I know some of you are students, you're already committed. That's why I said, if career or other circumstances dictate what you should learn next, let that happen, right? I don't want to say, oh, hey, you're in the middle of school, start learning a new language, and then you put aside your studies. That's not the goal. This is really about, like, you know, adult learning. It works for students as well. That's who it was designed for. But it's really about what you can do to expand your knowledge. So if that is your case, if you're already out of school, figure out what time you can dedicate to this, right? As a part of making yourself better, right? You go to the gym however many hours a week. You do this however many hours a week. Commit to learning so many hours a week. Something outside of that standard set of things. Yeah. I think this might be the last question, or yeah, okay. All right.
Okay, hi. Let's try to the question.
Sure.
How do we identify things that we have to unlearn, and what would you recommend to do it? And in the case we find something.
That is an excellent question, and which I don't want to say that I feared, but the question is, how do you, when you discover that you do need to unlearn something, how do you do so? When you figure out that you've internalized falsehoods or bad habits, perhaps, right? I mean, this is something that coaches, particularly sports coaches, you know, this is something that they work on very, very hard and that they've tried to study. What do you do when someone has, for example, an emotion pattern or in a dance? If people continue to make the same mistakes by moving their body in a certain way, or, you know, certain players in whatever sport, soccer, baseball, basketball, if they have bad habits that don't produce good results, how do you unlearn that? How do you untrain that? But likewise, what do you do when you have items of knowledge? And I, at risk of running into the debate or the conversation yesterday, I will say that there is a certain act of free will that you have to engage in, right? And I learned this from a great set of lectures, which is available to you thanks to the Prometheus Foundation. Leonard Peikoff's set of lectures called The Art of Thinking, which has enormous value, more broadly than what I've just been talking about today. But he talks about that problem of how do you unlearn something, because he makes an analogy in that lecture to how you remove from your memory and your automated habits and your operational set of commands when someone in your life very important to you dies, right? And he tells the very poignant story of his own experience after Ayn Rand died, somebody that he had spent over 35 years with, right? As a student, as a colleague, as a collaborator. And then after she died, he literally had to go through the process of unprogramming his brain from doing things like automatically thinking, oh, I'll call her when I saw something in the headlines, or, oh, I should suggest, you know, the process where you do that ultimately sometimes comes down to an act of will of saying, when that arises, I will simply say, I have a process. I say, no, in this case, you know, no, that person is no longer alive. And you have to literally make that act of will of having whether it's a mantra or something you say, but when you have that automated knowledge or automated process, one of the most effective ways, the only effective way to do it, is to have a conscious interruption signal, right? And that's what they talk about with players who get bad habits, golf swings, whatever it is. They have signals that interrupt them. So what really good coaches do, if they're working on your golf swing or whatever it is they have a way of triggering you either physically or auditorily when you engage in that habit. It's almost Pavlovian in its feel, but it ultimately is that there has to be an interruption because you have to give your mind time to reintegrate the new knowledge. So for example, if you have a set of false beliefs, those false beliefs have action consequences, right? So you've adopted a set of false beliefs. You know they're false, but you want to stop acting on them. I mean, we can use the example from the other day, smoking a cigarette. You know, you just have this, I wake up, I have a cigarette. Or after I get done with a lecture, I mean, this is not me, but you know, you have these habits. You have to consciously unprogram those habits, but you have to make sure that you understand what are the action consequences of those ideas. And once you understand that, then you can insert that almost tangible interruption process. And when you do that, what you're actually doing is you're giving your subconscious time to start to integrate the new ideas. Because presumably, if you've discovered that old ideas are false, or that you want to remove certain ideas from your head, it's because you found what you want to replace them with. And then you have to engage in that active process of continuing to repeat those, encode those, and they'll gradually take over, in a sense, in your brain, that space that was occupied by the thing that you're now interrupting, that's no longer encoding itself. In the same way that you remember a new phone number, for example, right? I mean, everybody must have had the experience when you change a phone number and you start giving your phone number out and you start saying, oh, well, it's 94, oh, wait, no, actually it's 86, where you actually change, you have to change consciously. It's just that interruption process. Now, for big ideas, that takes longer. For smaller ideas, learning a new phone number, a new hotel number, it's pretty easy. All right, well, we definitely have to wrap up. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.